tell everybody, thank you for being here, first of all. And why don't you tell everybody a little bit about what congregation you serve and how long you've been there and what it's like?
Sure. And as I get going, if I start to cut in and out, just give me like a signal and I'll try and move somewhere else.
Okay, I'll give you
But
this.
okay. So I'm McKinley and I serve at Restoration, which is in the northwest part of Philadelphia in the Mount Airy neighborhood. We often get confused with the Unitarian Society of Germantown, which was the historically Unitarian congregation. And they moved into Mount Airy a while ago. We're the Universalist congregation that's been in Mount Airy since 1934, and I have been there only 3 years. This is almost midway through my third year, I guess. And I was on a contract for the first 2 years, and then I was called to be there, what we call the settled minister, in January, and that contract started, my new covenant, I guess, started at the beginning of this congregational year in August. So this is year 3, but also kind of year 1. And it's a pandemic. So does this year even count? And it is also 2020, which is a hot mess for everyone. But it's also our 200th anniversary as a congregation.
Wow.
So we have a lot going on.
I thought you said 1930 something, but is that the current building?
The current building. Okay. They moved out to Mount Airy. That was the suburbs then. It was originally, if I can remember my history. So it was originally part of the First Church of Christ, commonly called Universalist, which was downtown. And then they moved to Northern Liberties, and then to a place kind of just off Broad, North Broad. And then from there moved out to Mount Airy. So it's been kind of like 4 iterations of the congregation.
And some people may not realize, so Unitarian Universalism came from the merger of those two historic denominations, Unitarianism and Universalism. And the merger happened in 1961, right? Yeah. It's been a while since I had my MFC interview. So
we were the Universalist congregation. When I talk about the Unitarian Society of Germantown, they were the Unitarian. So they were 2 separate denominations in relative proximity, and then after 61 they became the same denomination. So it's pretty rare to have, outside of Boston, it's pretty rare to have 2 UU congregations only a mile apart. But that's how we are.
What does the Restoration name come from?
Comes from the Restoration theology controversy. So in the Universalist strain of Christianity that sprung up in America following 1770, John Murray was the first white English person to come and preach universalism in North America. And that started some of the official denominational work. And the understanding of universalism was that there was universal salvation. In the Christian context, that Universalists did not believe that the sovereignty of God would allow God to condemn anyone to hell forever. This was a really popular theology, like 19th century, pre-Civil War, especially in Europe and North America, and amongst Anglo folks, I guess, because other people and other cultures had their own strands of universalism, right, outside of Christianity. And Universalism was the 5th largest denomination
in America,
in North America. And then the Civil War happened, and with all the bloodshed and the horrors of slavery and the breaking of families, the breaking of our nation, people looked around at the carnage and said, somebody's got to pay for this somehow. This
God's forgiving that guy and me? What?
Right. And so that prompted this theory of restorationism, which I always tell people, if you follow sports at all, it's kind of like the penalty box.
In
analogy,
hockey.
Right? If you watch hockey, if you do something
a little
bad,
bit. I know about the Flyers because of Gritty, so I know enough.
That's right. So we call it the sin bin in rugby and in European sports. Like, if you do something bad, you can come back. It's gonna be fine, but you gotta spend a little bit of time in the penalty box, and that's what the Restorationist believe that there was some kind of punishment or purification that happened to someone's soul after death if they were really bad, but that eventually, the phrase is, all souls are reconciled or restored unto God. And the folks who were in our congregation split off from the main Universalist church
Ah.
that was down at Temple
Was that
because
after
they
the
were
Civil War?
restorationist. Yes. Yeah, this was
After the Civil War is close enough.
80s.
Okay.
Yeah.
1880s.
Yeah, and so that's where the name restoration comes from.
Yeah. So, you're talking a lot about how the name and the character of the congregation and the fact that it even exists is so rooted in its Universalist history. How would you describe the culture of the congregation today? Is it a more Christian leaning congregation as far as the UU world is concerned, or is it are there ways that history shows up in kind of your day-to-day week and worship? WellSprings
Yes,
being a very
history.
contemporary and new congregation, it's one of the things
Uh-huh.
that's kind of potentially very different. I'm just curious how you see it.
Yeah. So history shows up often, not necessarily in how we express our theology, because I would say that we're more like how I've experienced most UU congregations, and that it's not a majority Christian at all. We're the strong and dominant humanist strain, and people who identify kind of agnostic. We have a lot of folks who do Buddhist meditation, a few Christians, folks who follow Hindu teachers. So a fairly good mix, but it's not a typical what you think of as a like the First Church in Worcester, Massachusetts, for example, which was one of our Christian UU congregations, where their liturgy and their flow of service every week feels very much like a typical liberal Protestant service. They just don't say the Nicene Creed, and we're not like that. But the history comes in every week because we meet. When we met in person, we had this wonderful historical sanctuary that features what we call the history window, and it's the history of English Universalism in North America. And it shows kind of these two strands. It's a really beautiful stained glass window. So we have that history. We have a lot of Christian iconography around. So we have a rose window with gospel language and the lamb in the center behind the altar. We have two transepts. Our sanctuary is cruciform, so it's in the shape of a cross.
Right.
That's how it was built in 1934. And
So there's seats on the side towards the front, in addition to one big long
yes,
room. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
And so we've taken seats out on one side, so most of our folks fit in kind of the main along the transept area. So we are surrounded by history, and I think how I have felt our history show up, the universalism that promotes love, well, what I call love with a capital L, that shows up every week. In the spirit of welcome and the spirit of the old universalist who would do almost evangelical type of barnstorming and evangelizing and trying to convert people, that energy shows up. That we focus a lot on love and joy, and it's been a different feeling for us the past few months because it's been hard to find those things.
Yeah.
But that theology, a theology of that love, is what shows up. So Christianity, we have so many folks who come wounded from other denominations, especially from Christianity, that's part of our history too, and it shows up in those ways. So not necessarily in how we affirmatively express our theology, but sometimes how we negatively express our theology.
Talking about what we aren't instead of what we are.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's something that all of us have to kind of work through. And I think we've done a really good job of working through it together, especially having me as the minister that's allowed people to confront those things and to have really meaningful and intimate conversations about who we are and not just who we aren't.
I think it's one of the more complex things that is often unspoken in our denomination, that as a people and as a community, Unitarian Universalists include lots of people who have a Christian background or who were raised Christian, who are consciously rejecting or leaving behind, or in some cases, as you said, actively were wounded by that history, and coming to Unitarian Universalism to find something different and something that fits them better and something that's often healing for them. And yet Unitarian Universalism as a whole also kind of has that story. I mean, Unitarian Universalism, those two denominations were Christian denominations. They were progressive Christian denominations. And the denomination itself in 1961 sort of left that behind, and articulated a new sense of faith identity for itself. So it probably makes sense in some kind of family systems model, right? That people are attracted to our denomination for exactly that reason. But it makes it interesting and complicated also. Yeah. Well, you mentioned that obviously when you met in person, that you met in this traditional, beautiful stone building. I'm just curious. I'm asking every minister that I talk to on these Tuesday calls, what kind of shifts and changes have you all made it because of the pandemic at Restoration? What looks different now for you?
Yeah, I think like everybody, we have embraced the theology of Zoom and used that, I think, to really great effect to continue having high quality, meaningful worship. And we meet every week, same time. We haven't really had to shift the kinds of things we can do in service. We just had to shift how we do it. So the music has been the biggest change. And in losing the in-person music, and as a small congregation, we have a wonderful part-time music director. But for 2 Sundays of the month, we would make it happen with lay folks and with guest musicians.
Do you have a choir?
We do. We do. So we'd have choir twice a month, and then whatever we could put together for the other 2 times. And that's been the big shift, because we lost some of the intimacy of in-person music and hearing our choir, but we've gained freedom in being able to do lots of different things. So this past week, we got to have African drums as a prelude and the Circle of Life from The Lion King as a postlude with some jazz music in the middle and a traditional hymn to close it. Like, it was lovely. So we've learned to be more adaptive and resilient in that way. But people are missing their community, and it doesn't always feel the same.
You do your worship service on Zoom, it sounds like. Do you stay on for a coffee hour afterwards where people chat with each other?
We do. We do. And we're learning how to do that in better ways as well.
Right.
We had a wonderful conversation this past week, and then sometimes people got things to do. So it's kind of similar to how it is when we were in person, that you'll get coffee hour where people can't leave, and then sometimes people head out. But especially for our elders who are so isolated, I think like everyone, that is a real concern. And so we're looking at how we can move into something a little bit more personal in the future, if we're allowed, and how we can start to have one-on-one conversations with appropriate precautions. It's a lot.
It is a lot. I agree. Yeah. And our coffee hour is the same way. I think this past Sunday we had maybe 9 people who signed on, and then sometimes we have 30, and we have to split into small groups. And no rhyme or reason. I think, just like you said, it's also one of the reasons it's a lot, right, is because it's hard to figure out sometimes. Is this just normal? Before all this started, week to week, sometimes it was bigger, sometimes it was smaller, and sometimes people were chatty and sometimes people were quiet, and that it could be the same kinds of things happening, or it could be something about what's going on this year. And but we show up, right? We do our best. So so
we have
go ahead.
We have this, how does our history and theology show up? So this universalist idea, when we first started doing online worship, I was like, hey, we just got to put something together, and if it works, it works, but we got to try something. And what I was really pushed by the congregation to do was to be as inclusive as possible for all of our people. And we have about 90 members, people who have signed our membership book, And then I say we have about 30 folks who are friends and
Mhm.
visitors, some long-term, some infrequent, but still a part of our community. So I say that we serve about 120 people.
Mhm.
And to try and reach all those people is a huge task for one person, for two people. But it was really important to the congregation to have everyone be able to access the service and everyone be able to talk with everyone in some way. So when we first started, we had we have a camera in our sanctuary that we have used to live stream that very few people watched before the
Mhm.
pandemic, but we had the infrastructure. So we had that camera going. We had the Zoom camera
Mhm.
going. So we were going over Zoom. We were for people to be intimately connected.
Mhm.
We had it going over the sanctuary live stream camera for our people who didn't know how to use Zoom to watch that. And then we broadcast it on Facebook Live for people who just had Facebook.
Mhm.
So we were streaming it in three different places in three different
Mhm.
ways. And for the first month, that was a lot. We found a way to since integrate all that and make it much easier.
Yeah.
Uh, and I was like, I cannot keep this up.
You were setting it up every week and making sure it was all working.
I
Yeah.
was, and I was literally the only person who could do it
Mhm.
because of the technology required. And my board was unwilling to have less inclusive worship. And I think that stems from the universalist idea that like everyone is just as important.
Yeah.
And so if we can, we will do it. So I've been really pleased with that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to share that story.
That's a good story, and a good example of how we actually live our values and some of the choices we make that seem small or that seem totally unrelated to our belief system, but they're part of it. I
Mm-hmm.
know for our board, that's been a big conversation in thinking about if we're going to have any kinds of in-person activities outdoors that we also kind
Mm-hmm.
of um, it's funny, we kept using the phrase lowest common denominator, and we're like, that feels wrong, like it's actually the highest common denominator, right? Like, but it's lowest in terms of how much risk are people willing to assume and how much are we
Right.
going to ask them to assume, to do things like
Mm-hmm.
that. So um, yeah, I'm planning, so far I'm planning on Thursday to go do my first outdoor drop-in hours where people can come by, and I'll be wearing a mask the
Mm-hmm.
whole time, and I'll be asking people to wear masks the whole time. And I'm thinking
Mm-hmm.
about that, like, okay, that might not be what people are used to if they're outside, but part of why we're
Right.
doing that is so that we can be as inclusive as possible for people who may not be comfortable if I'm sitting there without a mask. So
Right.
it's a lot, as you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, so Ken, one of the things that one of the first times I think actually that I went to the building where Restoration has met in the past and will meet again. Um, a few WellSprings members joined me actually when you all first started having your outdoor vigils on the street for Black
Mm-hmm.
Lives Matter. It was once a week, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And we went kind of as a group. I think there were about a dozen of us from WellSprings who joined.
Mm-hmm.
It must have been 2 or 3 years ago now. But I remember members of my congregation remarking like how incredible it was that you all had a weekly commitment to show up and do a witness like that. And I told people, that the congregation has a really strong and long tradition of justice work and showing up for social change movements and social justice. So I'm curious, especially in 2020 with all
Mm-hmm.
that has happened apart from the pandemic, how has your justice work changed or shown up this year?
Yeah. So to tell you about
Mm-hmm.
2020, I have to take you back to the 60s
Okay. I'm ready.
because that's where it starts. So post-merger UU's 1960s. For those who were alive in the 60s, there was a lot going on then,
Mm-hmm.
as now. And Mount Airy in the 40s, um, po- and immediately post World War II, was a white suburb. And I don't know if it was in the city limits then, it's in the city limits now, but it was an all-white community. And as black folks got enough capital to move out, they started doing so. And to prevent white flight from our section of Mount Airy, and to prevent the ghettoization through the forces of the real estate companies and capitalism and redlining and blockbusting and all those predatory practices, the minister who was at Restoration, Reverend Rudy Gelsey, helped form a collective of ministers and lay people in the neighborhood to go and prevent these practices. So white families would show up in place of black families to look at houses and put offers in on the house, and there was a black family who could move in. They boycotted real estate companies that use redlining.
Wait a second. So
and
hold on. So
yeah,
I want to make sure I get that right. A black family would want to buy the house, but they would send a white family to like
yes,
walk through.
to look at it. Yes.
Oh my gosh. And that was organized
Yes.
by the minister at Restoration and other people in the neighborhood.
And in conjunction with other people, yeah. Rudy was one of the founders of East Mount Airy Neighbors, and that's an organization that still exists today and still holds zoning hearings and
Cool.
looks to, keep our neighborhood integrated socioeconomically, racially, keep it diverse, and keep it, kind of weird. And so
I'm
now
sorry I
lots
interrupted
of
you. I just didn't want to. I
no,
was like,
that's
wait,
fine.
what? Yeah, go ahead.
So lots of black families could move in and buy their own homes, and that's why Mount Airy looks the way it does. And it is super integrated, and lots of people own their homes, and there's a mix of rental properties and owned properties. And it started to shift a little bit with the pandemic and with some of the other forces going on, but East Mount Airy Neighbors still holds that role. So Rudy was the one who instigated that and pushed the congregation to say, no, we're going to do this. This is how we live our faith out loud. And before that, the folks at Restoration, they were having high tea on the lawn on Tuesday afternoons with servants with white gloves. They were an all-white congregation. Then the 60s roll around. Some of our eldest members our eldest African-American members joined the congregation to integrate it. And then it's started to reflect our neighborhood more and more. So our demographics, depending on how you count, we're somewhere between 30%, 40% people of color. So it reflects our neighborhood. It's a more diverse congregation than most UU congregations. So we don't really have the option to not talk about these things and to not do something about it. And that is part of our DNA. So when Michael Brown was murdered, we started this weekly Black Lives Matter vigil. This was before my time. But it has continued for 6 years every week without fail.
And it's continued in 2020.
Continues in 2020. That was one of the hardest decisions that I had to make. And I'd just been called as the minister. And I had to decide, are we going to shut down the vigil or not? And so we made some stipulations about how many people it could be, and it was a really low number, but as long as there was someone there. And it has continued outside with distancing. They've gotten so creative. They have their assigned places where they do their vigil outside, and then they light candles outside as well. And we've added a Zoom component, so now people can be there digitally, which has actually made it more inclusive.
Yeah. Like somebody has a tablet or a laptop that they're out there with?
Somebody has a laptop, and when I go, I bring my phone, and we hook up on Zoom so people can share their joys and concerns. And they have a little prayer service after they stand vigil. And it's become its own, I don't know if y'all have covenant groups or fellowship groups or small groups, but it's a way for people to express their spirituality through action and through community. And it's really, really great. It's one of my favorite things about them.
That's awesome. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you all had, I know that has been going on every single week for so many years, and I wasn't sure how the pandemic affected it. So,
Yeah. And Bruce Pollock Johnson is one of our members, and he is one of the co-authors, along with Paula Cole Jones, of the Eighth Principle. And the Eighth Principle Project and the Eighth Principle Movement kind of founded at Restoration. So for those who don't know, that's about dismantling white supremacy culture and systemic oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. And we adopted that a few years ago. And I would say that is the biggest driver in our theology now, more than in conjunction with universalism, which is what Justin Schroeder preached about for the Murray Grove 250th anniversary, if anyone saw that the Eighth Principle and our universalist heritage really run parallel. And I think those are the greatest drivers of our justice work and how it shows up today.
Yeah. I'm looking at the questions I prepared for you, and I'm trying to decide which one I want to ask you next, because you kind of took us in an interesting direction. And I also want to make sure, we actually have a handful of people watching. So if folks have questions that they want to ask or topics that they want McKinley and I to discuss, type it into the comments and let us know. There's a little comment box at the bottom. We'll have time to talk about both of these. So one of the things that I plan to ask you a little bit about, and also one of the ways that I think some people in my congregation are familiar with you, is a little bit about your story being raised Christian in the South. You put a Facebook post up recently talking about, I think it was Trump's former campaign manager, and that was in theory what it was about, but you also used it to reflect on kind of your upbringing, how the way that you saw the world was influenced by your religion as you were growing up. And it resonated for a lot of people in my congregation. And I think that's part of that larger story that we were talking about earlier also, that a lot of you share some kind of experience of being raised in one sort of worldview or mindset and growing up and coming into a different kind of understanding of the world and finding Unitarian Universalism as like, I didn't even know this existed. I didn't know that there were people who believed the things that I actually believed in my heart. So if there's a quick version of the story, it doesn't have to be that quick. We have some time, but how did you come to call yourself a UU? You weren't always a UU, and now here you are, a minister.
Yeah.
How'd that happen?
So I grew up in the Texas Panhandle. I was born in Lubbock, Texas, which is home of Texas Tech University and Buddy Holly. And now the artist formerly known as the Dixie Chicks, now known as just the Chicks. Yeah. Shout out to Natalie Maines. So I'm from Cotton Country, and I grew up on a cattle ranch in the very top of the Texas Panhandle. So if this is a map of Texas, this is the Texas Panhandle, this is El Paso. And my family is from way up here.
Right by Oklahoma, right?
I grew up 10 miles from Oklahoma and an hour from Kansas. So everyone is nominally Christian in West Texas, even if you're what we call National Guard Christians, which is 2 weekends a year, Easter and Christmas, and 2 weeks in the summer for vacation Bible study. But there was also an underground strain of diversity, which I was not aware of until 9/11, until September 11th, 2001, when all of a sudden I was getting messages on Fox News about what radical Islam is, what Muslims believe, and then getting the messages from the people in my town, my friends and family. And I was receiving all this negative messaging and designed to promote hate and fear, right? And we got to take a comparative religion elective. And I found out that one of my friends, who I had known since we were 3 years old, we had gone to school together, and we were in 8th grade now. I knew she had darker skin than I did, but I did not know that there was anything different about her. And she brought her Quran.
Uh-oh. McKinley, you froze as soon as you said that. Are other people seeing McKinley freeze, or is it just me? How lucky are we just as the story gets interesting, right? McKinley's joining us from the Poconos, so I'm wondering if it's his Wi-Fi. Folks who are watching, if you type in the comments, is it frozen for you too? I wonder if he's sitting there talking. Yep, all right. I'm gonna re-invite him and we'll get back to the story. Hold on. Let's see. Hey, all right, we got you. Add. With an exclamation point on his face. Hey, sorry.
I got a phone call, and I think it.
Yeah. If I got a little upset.
Are we back?
I think we're back. We'll pray again. You were just at a very interesting point in your story, of course. You were just saying that in 8th grade, I think that your classmate brought a Quran for, was it show and tell or something else?
Yeah. And that was when I experienced this cognitive dissonance about what the messages I was hearing from the news and from my family and from friends and from pop culture and this person that I knew intimately, that I'd known since we were kids. So that was the first time that I thought about, like, oh, there's something besides Christianity that is real, that is tangible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It,
And go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, it was striking to me, even as you described kind of your worldview growing up, like everybody was Christian, and my first thought was, well, probably not everybody was, but of course,
Right.
But to you, everybody was. Like you didn't
Yeah.
see anything outside of that until that moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And never needed to know. Right. I was fully self-sufficient, had everything that I needed, and the world made a kind of sense until it didn't.
And you were talking about how that
so
was sort of revealing of like that there were different ways to be Christian. Is that part of what that started to open up for you? Or no? That you're saying something earlier about like there was more diversity within the Christian world that you grew up in than you realized at first.
I think just more diversity in the world that I grew up in, not just in Christianity. Yeah. The diversity in Christianity will come later, I think. So I was, after that, it's kind of expanded, and then grew up being a teenager where like other things were on my mind, mainly sports and young women. And I didn't really think too much about religion. My mom and my sister started going to an Episcopal church when I was in high school, and they're both Episcopalian now. I have an adopted brother who we would go to the Primitive Baptist church when we were growing up. But I was confirmed to the United Methodist Church. So as I get older, I started to learn more about the differences, but I was moving away from Christianity. And then I went to college at William & Mary and started getting to do academic study of religion, and loved it, and loved learning about the human side of religion and not having to wrestle with the inerrancy of the Bible or the supremacy of Christianity or anything like that. Just getting to study cultures and anthropology and history, I loved. So I graduated with a religious studies degree and had no idea what I wanted to do except coach basketball. So I moved to Connecticut to coach basketball and teach school at a small independent Catholic school in New Haven. And because I had done religious studies in college, I was the designated sub for their comparative religion class. So I got to teach comparative religion and give 8th graders the same experience I had when I was in 8th grade. And I fell in love with that. So I started thinking that maybe I want to teach in a seminary or teach in a college and teach some kind of religious studies. And we had a teachers conference in Baltimore. And I got randomly paired up to sit at a table with a guy wearing a clerical collar. And he was a Presbyterian minister who lived on Princeton Seminary's campus. And he had helped start the AmeriCorps program. And we just got to talking, and he said, "Oh, you got to go to seminary. This is where you're supposed to be. We were supposed to meet. And come stay with me. I'll get you an interview, and we'll get rocking and rolling." I'd never heard of Princeton Seminary, except that it was Princeton. I'd never been to New Jersey. And I went and stayed with him. He got me an interview. They asked me a question that I will never forget. "Who is your favorite theologian?" And like,
did you have an answer?
I was like, "Well, Jesus."
Right.
And I had just actually read a book by William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience, because that was kind of where I was at religiously, right? I was thinking about the psychology of it.
Studying
and,
it, yeah.
Yeah. And so I said that, and I God bless her, I still remember her writing it down and saying, "We've never had that answer before."
Instead of saying, "He's not a theologian," but nice try, close.
It was lovely. So somehow I got in and showed up less Christian, I would say, than I'd ever been in my life.
Huh. On your first day of seminary.
On my first day of seminary. And I showed up, and as I was walking into class, there's a yellow banner that says, like faith and responsibility or something, one of the taglines of the year. And honestly, Rev Lee, there was a praying mantis on this poster about faith as I was walking into my first day of seminary when I like didn't consider myself a religious person. It's like, that could be a sign. I don't know.
Maybe. A praying mantis on a sign. Yeah.
Who knew?
Yeah.
So I show up to Princeton Seminary, and without considering myself really Christian, except kind of nominally, right? I was a National Guard Christian probably at that point. Did not want to work in a church. Did not want to be a priest or a minister or a pastor.
You wanted to study. Yeah, and teach.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I started taking the classes and fell in love with studying again, and was able to kind of rebuild some kind of faith perspective. And the joke at Princeton, which is a Presbyterian affiliated seminary, on the liberal end, but not UU liberal, still, Orthodox Christianity. There's this legendary story of people who had come from the same background as me, growing up in a very conservative Methodist or conservative Primitive Baptist church, who learn all the stuff about the Bible that totally dismantles their faith and worldview. And then they have to build it back up. And there's this famous story of a first-year student standing up in class when a professor pointed out one of the inconsistencies in the Bible. And he starts tearing out pages of his Bible. This doesn't matter. This doesn't matter. And just throwing pages. And everyone just kind of sits there, and we're all kind of feeling the same way. And then apparently he got done, sat down, got his notes. Lecture continued. And everyone kind of goes through that, I think, in seminary. If you have the experience that I did, I think all of my classmates had the same experience. The difference for me was that I was ready for it. I was kind of yearning to rebuild something and reconstruct something and restore something.
You'd had that tearing out experience before seminary.
Yes,
yeah.
Right, right. But I still didn't want to work in a church. So I was able to rebuild this faith and started to consider myself more of a Christian, but more like a classically Unitarian Christian based on all the studying I was doing.
Would you have said Unitarian then, or is that more looking back at it you realized?
I would once I had that language. So once I took systematic theology and the history of the Reformation, I was like, oh yeah, like I get this. And so the history of Arius, one of our famous Unitarian ancestors,
way back
was a story that really resonated. Yeah. Was a story that really resonated with me. But to graduate from Princeton Seminary, you have to work in a church as your field ed placement. My first field ed was at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And I did chaplaincy, and I fell in love with chaplaincy, and I thought, this is what I want to do. And I want to teach and do chaplaincy. But you have to work at a church. And so I was like, fine. And I went to Church of the Holy Trinity on Rittenhouse Square, which is close to First U, downtown. It's an Episcopal church. I didn't have any interest in being an Episcopal priest. It was a tradition I was familiar with. I was like, let's just get it over with. Had a great meeting, was going to do homeless outreach ministry and their social justice work, because that's where I really felt called. And while I was in seminary, I was also working in Trenton, New Jersey, doing gang violence reduction and working with kids in Trenton. So I felt like that fits in well with the chaplaincy and the teaching, and this is where I'm headed. There was some bureaucracy involved, and I could not work at Church of the Holy Trinity for paperwork reasons. So I'm going into the summer between my second and final year of seminary with no church placement, and I just have to find somewhere. I'm living in Roxborough near Mount Airy, and I was working for my landlord painting houses in Mount Airy and Chestnut Hill. And I was driving up and down Lincoln Drive every day past the Unitarian Society of Germantown. And I had taken systematic theology and history of the Reformation. I said, I didn't know they were Unitarians still around.
We're not just old ancient guys in arguing with early theologian and church fathers. Yeah, we're still here.
I said, let me pull in there and see what's going on. I had no idea what Unitarian Universalism was. I literally just seen this sign on the side of the road. And our colleague Kent Mathias welcomed me. We talked for a little bit. I said, listen, I need somewhere to work as an intern. Can I do it here? And he goes, I mean, yeah. Do do you know what here is?
You're like, it's a church. That's what I need for to get my
I was like,
yeah.
it's the only box I feel like checking.
Yeah.
And I had a wonderful meeting with their board, and they explained a little bit more about it. And I just decided to give it a shot, really out of necessity more than anything. And then I experienced their first worship service, and being in their sanctuary, if no one has been there, it's similar to Restoration. It's an old Baptist church. So there's a beautiful stained glass window. It looks very Christian-y, very churchy. Mm-hmm. But they also have, on one transept, they have the old Unitarian stained glass windows from the original Unitarian church that burned down. Mm-hmm. They were able to
you froze. Okay, you're back. You froze for a second. They were able to save the stained glass windows.
And they have the 7 cardinal virtues. Mm-hmm. That are beautiful, but they're not expressly Christian, right? They're more humanist, and they're beautiful. And so to have this Unitarian, humanist, justice-oriented piece literally reconstructed onto this traditional Christian space, I was like, I feel like I'm sitting inside of my own body.
Wow.
Right? My own experience. Mm-hmm. And I fell in love with Unitarian Universalism and felt like that was the place where I could be my authentic Christian self. And that's kind of how it started. I still didn't want to be a minister, and Kent needled me into becoming one. And I got a chance to work in D.C. at the Fairfax congregation, and that really cemented it. And up until I took my ordination exam with the MFC, I was still not sure that I was going to actually go through with this.
Really? Wow.
But I have continued to fall deeper and deeper in love with the people and the tradition and the promise, I think, more than anything. I think it's the promise of Unitarian Universalism when fully lived out and realized that parallels the promise of America, right? Yeah. If we can be inclusive and great for everyone, right? What a world to live in.
Yeah.
And so I really believe in that. And that's why I stick around rather than going to another progressive Christian denomination or doing something else. It's because I believe in the work.
I think one of the things that is so hard about this time in our history, at least to me, is feeling like there are these competing stories of what America is, and what America is about, mm-hmm. and what that promise of America is supposed to mean. And it's interesting to me to hear you talk about that through the lens of your own life, seeing mm-hmm. these different voices literally on the TV screen and in your community growing mm-hmm. up, painting one version of what America's promise looks like. And then there are so many different strains of ideas about what America's promise really means. I mean, it's a big question, but how would you talk about kind of your hopes for how Unitarian Universalism can be in relationship with this idea of America moving forward? It's a big question.
I think it's the biggest question. Yeah. When we look at the history of the denomination and our merger, one of the things that Rosemary Bray McNatt told me,
another colleague,
and Christian leaning, said that after the merger, we gave up our seat at the World Council of Churches because we were no longer explicitly Christian and creedal. And as the popular view of Christianity has moved farther and farther to the right, we have not had any chance to speak to that, right? We have had no voice at the table, no place at the table to be the voice of liberal religion. We are, but we're small and we're not very loud, right? I was in seminary studying the history of Unitarianism, and I didn't know that they were still around today. So if I didn't know, how do we expect lay people to know? Yeah. So how do we reclaim our voice as liberal religious people? I think is really, really important. And that's what I try and push with our folks. And what that comes up against is the history of Christianity and the history of traditional Abrahamic faith religions that use traditional faith language and traditional faith practice, and oftentimes theistic, and the wounds that come along with that sometimes people can't engage.
Hmm.
And what I have tried to express to people is we've got to learn to be multilingual with our faith, and we have to learn to express what we believe, not just on our own terms, but in terms that other people can understand. Not to do evangelism to try and convert people, but to just get our seat at the table. And listening to Trip Fuller, the Homebrew Christianity podcast, he's part of the Wild Goose movement that I know you've been and seen.
Yeah, I've met him.
He said something on his podcast that really resonated with me, and that was that liberal progressive Christianity and the conservative Christianity that many of my family still practices, right? They are as far apart as you could get. But liberal Judaism, progressive Islam, progressive secular humanism, the ethical society movement, Unitarian Universalism, they are actually much closer together than progressive Christianity and conservative Christianity. That we actually have more in common with other religions and other denominations than two groups might have within the same strain.
That's part of why I've gone to these conferences, and why last year, 2 years ago, I went to the WITH conference, which is this conference for progressive evangelical new churches. And WellSprings culture and WellSprings style of doing worship, I was like, I've never felt more at home, than I have with these people. For me, going to General Assembly, I'm like, yeah, I get it, but it's not the WellSprings way of doing things. And this was, and I agree with you that extends to the people I know who are Muslim and queer, or who are female Muslim religious leaders, or very progressive Jews. Like, it's so interesting to think about realigning who we see as close to us in terms, or partners in this spiritual project, when it's not about what tech you need or what God do you pray to. It's more like, what values do you want to see living in the world? But yeah, it's complicated. and I think you're right that Unitarian Universalism, many Unitarian Universalists I don't know if we give when you say that we gave up our seat at the World Council of Churches, like, what a metaphor, right? Like, we take ourselves out of some of those conversations, I think. Yeah.
And for many of our elder members and our elder colleagues, right, they come from a different world where those wounds were more present, where the animosity was more present, where it might not have been just giving up our seat at the table, it was being asked to leave and having the seat taken away, right? But for the younger generations, we didn't grow up with that. We've grown up with a more pluralistic society and a more diverse and inclusive understanding of what it can be without those wounds. And I think the woundedness is what I feel really called to as someone who wanted to be a chaplain and a teacher and has worked with kids undergoing trauma and doing violence reduction and harm reduction. That if we're constantly operating from this place of woundedness, which is understandable, we're limiting where we can go and what difference we can make. And I tell this story about restoration. We have these transepts in this cross-shaped sanctuary, and they had this cool wood lattice work over the transepts. And because it was a Universalist congregation, at the top, there's a cross on either side. And at some point, someone from restoration has come and taken kind of wood cardboard chalices, nicely painted, but not expertly painted, and super glued them on top of the crosses so that you can't see them. And I get it, and I understand it, but that doesn't solve the problem. It's literally putting a Band-Aid on the stuff that's uncomfortable to talk about and deal with. And if all we're going to do as a denomination is put Band-Aids on things, what moral voice do we have? Right? Because isn't that what the conservative reaction to the 1619 project is to put a Band-Aid on it, is to not talk about it, is to not do healing, but simply to try and move on. And so we're falling victim to that too. I don't know what difference we can make. And I think we are so uniquely positioned as a pluralistic, multi-religious faith to be the voice, or to be one of the voices on the liberal end that helps shape the moral narrative going forward. But we can't do that from a place of woundedness. We can only do that from a place of groundedness and community and strength.
Yeah. And one of the things I hear you saying is that the woundedness makes us ahistorical sometimes, that it makes us cut off from our history.
Yeah, and I think it cuts us off from any kind of future. Right? If you're unwilling to do the work of looking back in your past and figuring out where you came from. Well, I used to work in a psych hospital in DC, and we talk about a disorienting dilemma that people experience, where all the things that you have learned growing up and all the ways that you've learned how to be suddenly no longer make sense. Right? So 9/11 was one for me, and I've had many since. But if you're unwilling to kind of reconstruct how you got to be where you are and let that stuff be a part of your story and not just cut it off, then you don't have anywhere to go from, right? You're constantly still trying to fight that battle in the past. And that's about the only, I see, we're getting to the end of an hour, but the Gadfly Papers was a hot mess. But that was actually one of the points that he was almost close to getting, is the historical divide between Unitarianism and Universalism is a little too simplistic. But that struggle, the internal struggle with theology, both for individuals and denominationally, either working from woundedness and who we aren't versus groundedness and who we are to look forward. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that to be found.
Yeah. Well, and it keeps us from being stuck. When you're always running from who you aren't, you're kind of stuck in it. Your identity is stuck in that thing that you're actually rejecting, but you're constantly defining yourself in relationship to it, which means that you're not really finding your own way. You're not really growing. Right. You're actually still stuck in that. You're just stuck in opposition to it instead of with it.
Right.
And yeah, I realized I knew that this was going to be an interesting conversation, and we were going to end up here, and it's 12:29. And I'm not in a super rush, but I don't know what you are, what you're.
No, I've got a few minutes.
Yeah. So, I mean, if anybody's watching and wants to type in a comment or a thought, feel free, chat it into the comments, and we'll answer it before we go. But I actually preached in some ways about this on Sunday. I'm realizing I told a story totally from a personal perspective of grief and woundedness, but the word, kicked my phone. But the words that she used echoed something you just said, where she talked about moving forward instead of moving on. Not thinking I cut this off and I throw it away, but reintegrating and incorporating where you've been into who you're becoming. And I think that's why this is, why I'm grateful to you for sharing so much about your own story and how you've grown and changed over time. And I think for all of us, that is a big part of why that matters, and why kind of sharing our stories is not just a navel-gazing exercise. It's because we can hear each other's stories that's what helps other people who feel like there's no way out of the world that they're in, that they might not fit in. That's what helps people go, oh wow, somebody else did it, or oh my gosh, I never knew how to articulate that until I saw that person describe it, and I feel the same way. So I'm grateful to you for sharing.
Yeah.
Oh, I did.
Richard Rohrer. While you read that question, Richard Rohrer is a Catholic theologian, a progressive Catholic, and one of his quotes that I love is, if you don't learn how to, you can do two things with your pain. You can either transmit it onto someone else, or you can transform it. Right. And that's what I try to do when I preach. I try and share my story so that we can learn not just to transmit, but how to transform and how to create something.
Yeah. That's a favorite quote of ours at WellSprings also.
Yeah.
Tony, hi Tony. Tony's watching. Tony, and she is asking, she's a member of our congregation. I think this is a question for you, Ken. How did your family take you becoming a UU? She says, I'm from a Southern Baptist upbringing, and my family was very unhappy.
Similarly, a lot of confusion at first, a lot of concern about the state of my soul and the state of the souls of my congregants.
Just to sprinkle some extra guilt in there, the souls of your congregants.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you follow the timeline, right, my path also parallels the 2016 election, where we had other reasons to be unhappy with one another. So the UU side is actually not even their most critical point of me. It's my liberalness in general. Um, so that's the conversation. I think for me though, I'm lucky to have the privilege of being a minister, right? So that carries weight, that even if I was, I don't know, and Unitarian Universalist sounds vaguely Christian, right? So if they don't know, they don't really know. But
You're
yeah,
saying there's kind of a
similarly.
respect for you being a minister or a pastor.
Yes.
Yeah, that
Yes.
helps counterbalance some of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You're close with your mom, I know. Do you not talk much about faith with her, or does she have a different understanding?
We talk about it frequently. She's an Episcopalian. She's an elder white woman, and her religious identity is also very cultural. In that it's quiet and it's data driven and it's pleasant and people don't yell when they preach and give me facts and figures and nice hymns.
So if you do that as well, that's what's most important.
Yes. No, we talk about it a lot though, and she didn't get it at first. I think she gets it now, and she watches our services at Restoration, and we've really bonded over my learnings and teachings about different, separate from church stuff, like Celtic Christianity and progressive Christianity. And we want to go to the island of Iona at some point when we can. So she's a very spiritual person and was much more open to it than some of my family members. Yeah.
Mary in our congregation just said, I'm enjoying the conversation. My family's not happy with me either. Yeah. And
that is so hard. So not only since I've been a full-time minister, but for other reasons. Like, I don't get to see my family at Christmas, and it's a little unclear how it would go if I showed up at Christmas. And for us, I'm one of the first men in my family to graduate from college and to go on and get extra education. And so growing up how I did in Texas, I was one of the favored sons of our family, of our town, of our area. And I think there's a real sense of betrayal on their part, that they feel like I have left them. And there's so much wrapped up in that they feel like I think I'm superior to them, like I'm better than them. And there's so much woundedness in them, right, that is driving all the Trumpism, that is driving all the sense of division. And so that's what I also try and preach to our people, right, that we've got to deal with our woundedness in really real ways, both personally, with the help of therapists and professional help, and communally. And so being the person who's designated the leader to do that, I feel really called. And that's something I've tried to do with my family in small doses. And that's something that my social location and my skin color allow me to do. It's what my gender allows me to do. And so I try and flex that whenever I can, because it is so hard. So hard. And I don't know where it goes, but I know that is something that we can offer to people, is a roadmap for how to do it and how to process it afterwards when it inevitably either goes well or doesn't go well.
Yeah. And a space to come back to where we'll be held because we believe in that universalism. Do you know the author John Pavlovitz?
Yeah.
2 weeks ago, I used a quote from an article of his where he was talking about the state of our political world and the election coming up and grief. And, he wove in so beautifully just what you were talking about, the grief that he feels when he looks around at people who raised him, people who he used to look up to, people he used to want to be like, and sees some of what they're sharing on Facebook, or sees how they argue about why you should vote for their candidate. And he says, but I can take a step back and realize they feel the same way about me. You know, they sort of what you were saying, you know, they saw me growing up, they had hopes and dreams for me, and they feel like what happened, he lost his way, you know, how can he believe that? And he seemed to suggest that same kind of thing, that there's promise in that grief, actually. You know, there's promise in actually not running from or shoving that down, but starting there, you know, as the connecting point, that at least you have that in common. You know, you can start to rebuild or understand each other across that connection. Yeah. Oh gosh, a long comment. Let me just check and see if there's a question here. Joshua
Sure.
Long. Hey, good to see you, McKinley and Lee. Do you know Joshua Long from
I do.
Yeah.
Hey, Josh.
Josh says, I'm curious what y'all think. Oh boy, this is gonna be long. I'm curious what y'all think the relationship Unitarian Universalism should have with conservative evangelicalism and more conservative Catholics. He says, typically many UUs are wounded from these faiths. Is there room for engagement and shared commonality beyond our personal families? Ooh. So he's asking about shared engagement and community with conservative Catholics and conservative evangelicals and UUs.
I think that's not a job for us just as UUs. I think if we were able to form some kind of coalition with the other liberal ends of faith, because Josh, I don't know if you were on earlier, but I was talking about me as a Christian person. I have almost nothing in common with someone who's on the super conservative end of Christianity, besides like the very, you know, scripture, right? But I have so much in common with
McKinley froze again for me. He came back last time that this happened, but he's not coming back right now. I don't know if you all see a frozen McKinley or not. Josh, I know that what he was about to describe, because he talked about this earlier, was kind of the relationships that, oh yeah, he went away. All right, well, we'll get him back at least to say goodbye, because I think we're going to have to wrap up soon. But Josh, hey, Lauren. Josh, McKinley was talking before about the relationships between progressive people of all different faith traditions, and how much more he feels like he has in common with progressive Jews or progressive Muslims than he does with the more conservative strains. McKinley says phone call. Oh no, somebody called you on the phone. That happened to me last week, Ken. All right, hold on. I don't have an invite button for you. Yes, I do. Here we go. All right, we'll bring you back. Hey, that happened to me last week. I tried to describe a little bit of what I knew. Yeah, I tried to describe a little bit of what I knew you were going to say in your answer, because you talked about it before, just the feeling that you have more in common with the more progressive wings of other faith traditions. Yeah. So I don't know if you had more to your answer for Josh or not, in terms of whether there's a possibility for Unitarian Universalisms to be working with more conservative evangelicals or Catholics.
Yeah, so I think that's not our job, is kind of my answer.
Yeah. It's an interesting question.
We're too far apart.
It calls to mind for me the same question that people get about, you know, do you cross the aisle? Do you work with people of very different political persuasions, or do you try to build coalitions with other people who think like you? And I don't know that I know the answer. Honestly, you ask me on a different day, I'll tell you different things. Some days I feel like go for the victory, eye on the prize, work with the people, you know, build more power for your side, because that's what our values teach us, and that's what we want in the world. And then there are times that when I feel maybe a little more universalist, and I think, no, we have to bring everybody along. So that means we also have some responsibility to be in relationship with the people who feel differently. And depends on the day, honestly, for me. I don't know, Josh, that's probably a very unsatisfying answer. We tried.
No, I think when I say it's not our job, but I think if we form these coalitions, the people who are within those denominations and from that culture, I think it's their job, and we give support to that. So it'd be someone like Richard Rohrer's job. It would be, um, working from within the house rather than an external person like
People
me.
who are closer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, makes sense. In here, and then I think we'll have to go. I think you also have a delay for me now, Ken. So our phones are getting tired. Mary says I have more in common with my uncle, who is a Rev in the liberal Lutheran religion, than I do with my conservative Christian family. Yeah. Yeah, we have, it reminds me of how we talk sometimes about using our privilege to make change, and how for me as a white person, and for many white folks who consider themselves anti-racist, we have a different relationship in terms of educating other white people versus people of color. And it may not, for a person of color, it may not feel like their job to be educating white people. Whereas for me, that feels like work that I'm close to, that's proximate for me, and that I can do more effectively, and that I have more energy for. So it is universalist in the end, even to say we don't need to do that and build relationships with everyone, because to me, that's a very true representation of that universalist idea that all of us need all of us, right? We all have some role in this work, and we all can pick it up. We don't need to do everything ourselves. We shouldn't. That's not
Mm-hmm.
universalism. We should be part of affirming all of our diversity, is affirming the diversity that we can work in different ways to get towards that same goal. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think for me, from my theological perspective, right, there's the trust in bigger forces at work, that there are bigger forces at work that have formed my family members and formed so many people into states of woundedness and the messages of fear and hate that constantly get put out, that they're man-made systems. So we can unmake them and remake them and reconstruct. And the trust in larger forces that are man-made, and then maybe larger forces that aren't, that come from somewhere deep within or deep beyond, that trusting in that at work as well, through us, with us, that's where I find the hope.
Yeah. That same larger force that sent you a praying mantis on a sign back in the day, right?
And love with a capital L.
All right, Ken, thank you for hanging on for an extra 15 minutes or so. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much. I can tell people really enjoyed this conversation today. I'm going to download it and put it on YouTube. So if you want to share it with anybody in your congregation, feel free.
That'd be great.
Yeah. And I'm so grateful that you are a part of our faith, and you're part of it, reluctant as you might have been at first, that you're one of the voices in thinking about what Unitarian Universalism is and what will be in the future. So thank you so much for this hour plus.
Thank you, Reverend Lee. I appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Have a good rest of your day. Enjoy the beauty of the Poconos.
Will do. Will do. Take care, everyone. Will do.
Bye.